Hello everybody and welcome to our weekly study series. This week we will be reflecting on the creation stories found in popular thought in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. These are not without controversy, and I thought before we get into maybe a wider discussion of creation and creation stories in the Bible, we'll tackle head on a couple of the more thorny issues that scholars have debated in the last 100 years. That is the authorship of the Torah, the five books of the Torah being the first five books of the Bible, and also creation itself, and whether to take a literal interpretation, particularly of the first chapter of Genesis. So, of course, tradition has it that the five books of the Torah were written by Moses himself, and there is some internal consistency in the Bible. In the New Testament, Jesus himself and the apostles talk of the law as given by Moses, or the history as given by Moses, and they seem to be referring to the books of the Torah. So there seems to be some consistency that suggests that the tradition of Moses as the author could be given. But scholars have shown that actually when you look at the texts in Genesis and in the other books of the Torah, that tradition is difficult to maintain. We see different texts. In fact, we see, strangely, the name of God referred to differently in some of those texts. In some texts, like Genesis chapter 1, we speak of Elohim as God. In chapter 2, we see written Yahweh. Indeed, if you look at the English interpretations, you'll see in chapter 1 it says God. In chapter 2 it says the Lord God, to show that difference. In the priestly writings that form parts, particularly of Leviticus, we will see that God is referred to as El Shaddai. And so this, scholars suggest, is indicative perhaps of different writings. But the traditionalists will strongly maintain, because perhaps they've always been taught, and the church has taught, that Moses wrote the books of the Torah. So they will maintain that there's the consistency argument, and maybe Moses himself collated some of these texts. I think it's difficult because there are places that are mentioned that Moses couldn't have been aware of. He never entered the promised land. There are circumstances mentioned in the Torah, like the Philistines being in the promised land, but they didn't enter till hundreds of years after Moses would have died. So there are circumstances described there that are hard to maintain. But honestly, it seems to be an argument born out of tradition rather than born out of a desire to understand the God story. Because does it really transform our understanding of God, or particularly of Jesus at the heart of the Torah? I'm not sure that it does. And what of literal creationism? If you want to believe that the world was actually created in 7 literal days, good luck. For me, I'm quite fond of the idea of fairies at the bottom of the garden. I remember reading stories from a book when I was a small child that I was captivated by. Now, it turns out that is not really sustained by science, and honestly, neither is 7-day creationism. But truthfully, if that's your issue, great. I am not here to tell people what to believe and how to believe those stories. My point would be that if that is your issue, it seems to me to be a conservative issue where they're trying to defend the integrity of the Bible. And that's fantastic. Now let's just think of a couple of things. First of all, do you think the people that wrote the creation stories had any doubt that God created the world? I think not. So I don't think that's necessarily their purpose. But that seems to be what we want to cling to as conservatives. We can't doubt the literal truth of what is being said, because somehow that will undermine the Bible undermine our faith? What can we trust? And here's what I would say. I think the problem with this approach is literalism is interpreted in numerous different ways, just like we might interpret the Psalms as being literary true, not realise they were songs. Or we might interpret the prophecies as being magical words from God. This is all very difficult. And here's how I'd answer it. I don't mind how people choose to believe these things. But if the question that's being asked of the Bible is not given in answer Jesus, then I think it's the wrong question. So look, if you focus on the God story in the Bible and focus on Jesus at the heart of the whole of the Bible, then the creation stories are much richer, much deeper, are much more consistent and far less controversial, in my opinion, than perhaps the traditional controversies would have them. Let's think about a couple of things. This you know very well. The very beginning of John's Gospel reads as follows, and I'm sure you know it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This could be taken as one of the creation stories. It puts Jesus right at the centre of creation, and therefore of all of the creation stories. And when I say all of the creation stories, I'm not just referring to the first and second chapter of Genesis, which I'll mention in a moment. There are other stories of creation. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, we read about wisdom being the inspiration of the power of God, the creativity being the wisdom of God. And we can maybe talk another day about the feminine aspects of the person of wisdom, the aspect of God that brings about the beauty of creation. Or what about Job, chapter 38, after God speaks out to Job and says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When I laid out the seas and the oceans and the heavens? Where were you, man? Who are you to question me, the great creator of the universe?" Now, these tell very different stories, but tell stories of God. They tell stories of God's creativity through power, through wisdom. And we see a consistency starting to emerge in all of the creation stories. They're all linked together. We looked at Isaiah, we looked at Hosea, we looked at the prophecies during the Assyrian exile and the Babylonian exile. Now, the Babylonians had a tradition at New Year of celebrating creation, strangely enough, and they would celebrate particularly their God. And when the Israelites were in captivity, slaves to the Babylonians would lord it over them. Our God is better than your God. Imagine those poor Israelites in captivity who wept as they sat down by the rivers of Babylon. They wept as they remembered Zion, and they told themselves stories. Maybe they told themselves stories of their God, who could bring light out of darkness. And maybe this is the consistent prophecy that we see in Genesis chapter 1, in John's Gospel, in Isaiah's prophecies, in the writings of St. Paul, that Jesus is the answer to the God story that runs all the way through the Bible, in the miracles, in the sayings, in the letters, in the prophecies, in the history of Israel and of Judah and the very creation of the universe, maybe, just maybe, Jesus is the answer and at the heart of these things. You know, I do like my cereals for breakfast. I'm sure you do too. I don't know what your choice is. Maybe you are fond of cornflakes or Weetabix or sugar puffs or something more modern like Cheerios or crunchy nut cornflakes. Whatever they are, good luck to you. I am particularly fond of muesli. And it's a very straightforward sort of thing, really, is it? You put out your cereal, you go to the fridge and get your milk, and you pour the milk on the cereal, and before it goes soft and mushy, you eat the cereal, and it's a great start to the day. I remember going round next door to Mrs. Hughes' house. Mrs. Hughes had 3 lovely daughters, and I can't exactly remember the reason. Maybe it's rather obvious, but I went round early one morning, and Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Hughes invited me to have breakfast with them. Fantastic. And they said, what would you like? Cornflakes, muesli? Oh, I'll have muesli, please, Mrs. Hughes. And they poured out the muesli, and then, much to my horror, they took the pan of milk off the stove and poured the milk on the cereal. And they all ate their cereal with hot milk. I didn't even know this was possible. I didn't know anyone would do this. Everything went mushy. And it just wasn't breakfast. This was an interpretation of breakfast I had never conceived of, or heard of, or dreamt of, and frankly, it's one that I'd never really want to conceive or hear of or experience again. Breakfast? Why am I talking about breakfast? To make a simple point that actually we have beliefs that are born out of our history, our circumstances, our family, or our church, and often we'll cling to those, and it can come as a complete shock to find there are other ways of interpreting or understanding. And then we'll enter debate and arguments, and you know what? We have a tendency to cling. So those things that we hold dearly, cold milk on cereals, I couldn't imagine it any other way. The Bible is about the truth, but the truth for a Christian is about Jesus Christ. And so as we seek to understand the truth of the Bible, I think one of the problems is if we come to it with our interpretations, with our beliefs, with our ideas, and we're not open to seeing Jesus in here, then we're going to struggle from the beginning to the end, from the creation stories, through the miracles, through the letters. If the answer is not Jesus, it will be a fruitless search. Now, as part of our study this week, I've included a couple of creation stories that I've mentioned that might surprise you. Proverbs talks about wisdom. Job talks about power. But then, if you read the passage I've given you in 1 Corinthians, where is the one who is wise? Where is the debater of the age? And it goes on to say that Jews seek signs, and Greeks seek ideas. But for Jews and Greeks who are committed Christians, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So, brothers and sisters, I want to appeal to you as we feed on the creation stories. Seek Jesus. Seek Jesus. Seek Jesus in these stories through the Bible, and you will find that your search is much more fruitful, because the truth of God, as the Bible testifies, is revealed in his Son.